Hi, my name is Hannah, and today we will interview Dr. Kirk, based in Trinidad, in the Caribbean. Dr. Kirk Megu is an author, former senator, and university lecturer. Also, he is media personality for more than 20 years. Today, he gives us his view on key trends, particularly geopolitical trends, as we emerge into a post-pandemic world.
This podcast channel is about you, successful international entrepreneurs, successful expats, successful investors. Sponsored by HTJ Tax.
And we're live, Dr. Megu. How are you today, sir?
Good. And I hope you're doing well too.
Thank you very much. I am. So please, to those who may be watching or those who may be listening on various podcast platforms that we distribute on, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Dr. Kirk Megu. I'm a political economist, media broadcaster. I'm a former senator, former university lecturer, author. So I do consultancy, and I've got into social media and even doing some private coaching for other academics who want to get their voices heard in media, both traditional and the new media as well. So but it's all centered around socio-cultural economic analysis.
That's great. And as we were talking about previously off camera, you've had you're a Renaissance man, and you've been all over the world, and you have that global perspective that I think that our target audience would really engage with and enjoy. So with that in mind, I don't mean to sound like a real cliche when I say that this is unprecedented, because that word has become, it's just been thrown around. But it is what it is, right? It's unprecedented. We have not been here before. So in the sense, as we adjust to this so-called post-pandemic world, what do you see as the key trends to pay attention to?
Well, in terms of in terms of the pandemic, of course, the first thing we have to watch out for is what has actually been the effect of the lockdown. I mean, people have been projecting. I am very critical of the global lockdown. I think it was uncalled for, this shutting down of the global economy, the first time in human history. I mean, I am of the view that globalization is actually not new. It didn't start in the 80s. It's actually quite old, very old, definitely in the 19th century. That's how persons like yourself, an African, went to the Caribbean, or myself, an Indian, because the world was a global space for a very, very long time. And so this shutting down of the global economy is even worse than World War I, World War II, right, where there was a big shutdown. The economic depression in the 1930s was also a huge shutdown because of depressed economic activity. But this is a purposeful, planned, and I've always wondered, it's not as though it's not as though economic forecasters could not imagine that if you shut down the world economy for 3 months, this might have an impact on the airline industry, or perhaps unemployment, or perhaps small and medium enterprises. Anybody with half a brain cell would know that this would be the result. Now, we can only guess as to what the final result will be. Some people have projected, huge catastrophe and increased famine and whatnot. So, and how do we come up from that? Other people are fairly confident that we can get back to some sort of new normal, as they call it. And so that the first thing is, how do we recover from this self-inflicted wound, and the protocols of what is being projected as the new normal. I think that it may start to be contested as well. I think less so in it's interesting that the differences between because this is a global audience we're talking to now, Asia versus the Americas, for example. In Asian economies, there's much more of a consensus. There's much more of a trust in government, which has been earned. I think in the Western world, there's this projection onto Asian countries with strong governments that these are authoritarian, and I suppose by Western standards they might be, but they don't understand the socio-cultural milieu in which it operates, and also the high degree of trust that exists between the citizens and the government, which does not exist in the West. The default here is lack of trust, and the default there is trust. So I think in that sense, the Asian economies will have an easier time because when the governments and experts who are trusted come up with their recommendations, the population will largely come into place, and this is something I admire about a lot of these economies, that then when there are mistakes they adjust, and then the population follows along, and everything is basically done in good faith, more or less, whereas in the more rambunctious democracies of the West, there's all these factions and hidden agendas, and therefore lack of trust, and so in terms of the coming back, what sort of social protocols will be in place, what sort of restrictions on businesses, and these sorts of things I think will be contested, and in places like the United States, where you have 50 different states and cities have a lot of political autonomy as well, there'll be a whole hodgepodge of experiments, if you want to put it that way, different paces, different ideas on how we should open up, when we should open up, but the first thing is we have to see how much are we going to get back to the old normal in terms of social protocols, how much are we going to have a totally new system, which, as I said, the Asians, since the SARS crisis and all that, they have implemented some of that already, but it would be new over here on this side of the world. And then really to see, was the lockdown worth it? And was it actually more destructive than the disease ever could have been? And in the rambunctious dialogue and political contests that we find on this side of the world, this may be a bumpy process, right? This may be a very bumpy process. So it's really the opening up and even just debating the modalities of the opening up, I think, is going to be a major thing for at least the next year, if not way ahead of that.
Yeah, I mean, and those are great points, and that's something that I've seen myself moving back and forth, that we're using the same terminology like quarantine and lockdown and social distancing, but they have very different interpretations in different parts of the world. And I support your analysis. Definitely in Asia, it's stricter, no judgment, but it is stricter. Whereas in the West, it seems to be a recommendation. So, I suggest you stay home, but constitutionally we can't make you. So we just hope you stay home anyway. And, that's had, it will have consequences either way. And coming out of it, I guess for those who believe in the theory of herd immunity, whether it's a valid concept or not, who knows? I'm not a scientist. But if it is valid, then we have the West. And when I say the West, because even Russia's there, Russia has the capacity and their government to lock down if they really wanted to. But still, people are still allowed a degree of freedom. So you have Russia going into Western Europe, into North America. And if herd immunity is a thing, then we'll come out at the end of it with a population that is largely adjusted, whereas Asia will be resigned and confined to a series of lockdowns and reopenings, like Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, whatever. As you've seen, it's been like a yo-yo effect. As it spikes again, they clamp down, and then it'll open. So is that the future? I don't know, but it does seem to be east and west. And then in terms of pre-existing trends, we saw that economic nationalism was already on the upswing. That's why we had Brexit, we had Trump, we had Duterte in the Philippines, Australia, whatever. And now as countries close ranks and close borders, that will no doubt become even more of a thing. It'll become even more apparent that the free movement of people and ideas may be somewhat restricted and confined. What else do you see in terms of implications and trends?
Yeah, I think the point you make about economic nationalism is very, very important, especially for your audience and people like us who travel a lot. I don't know how much we're going to be traveling in the future, if we will be doing it so frequently anymore. And it's not only personal travel, but it's also trade. It's also production chains. And I am very sympathetic towards economic nationalism throughout the world. I do think that the gutting out of manufacturing and the hurting of the lower middle class in say Europe, England, the United States, has been devastating to people and economies and societies. Turning a factory worker who could support a family of, 2 children, a wife, and have a little home, into a Starbucks worker whose wife also has to work somewhere, and you're renting instead, and you can't afford to have kids. The economy has changed that way, and the inequality that has occurred. I do think that those aspects of globalization really have hurt people. But on the other hand, the 1990s, from that period where globalization hit its full swing with the World Trade Organization, with the end of the Cold War, with the expansion of these firms. On the other hand, that's when Asia, even Trinidad and Tobago, where I am right now, where you're from originally, and other places, that's when we started to boom. The 80s were a devastating time for us. So in a sense, kind of like the time of economic security of the Western world was not a very prosperous, dynamic time for us, but from the 90s and the 2000s, our economies started to really expand. We started to get consumer and luxury goods that we never had before at a mass level. Sure, the elite had it, but now it was available at mass levels throughout, Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America. So it was a time of increased prosperity for the rest of the world, and so I don't know if it is a zero-sum game. I would like to think that it's not necessarily a zero-sum game, but historically, when you look at it, the gains and the losses did kind of have to balance each other out in a way. But I do think that there must be a way that needs to be worked out where we can have industrialization and investment and trade throughout the world, throughout the continents, and throughout the regions of the world, without having to create misery elsewhere. From an economic theory standpoint, right? I would assume your audience would not be bored by this and would recognize the theory of comparative advantage, which is supposed to be the fundamental foundation of free trade. You know, when you look at the World Trade Organization, when you look at the mode of globalization that happened after the Cold War in the 90s and 2000s, it actually wasn't based on comparative advantage. It was based on absolute advantage, which is what Ricardo, the person who came up with comparative advantage theory, which is what he argued against, because he was showing that when two countries produce what they're best at and trade, the overall production output is greater. Even if one country can produce, you know, in his model, both goods cheaper. If this country can produce everything cheaper than country B, it still makes sense for country B to produce what it is best at, even if it is less efficient than country A, because country A could produce even its best thing even more efficiently, and then total productivity, total global output will rise, and so you have that. So the globalization that was occurring in the 1990s and 2000 was actually going to the cheapest labor in the world, going to the, you know, where the cheapest inputs in the world were. That is not what the theory of free trade and comparative advantage was about. It was about where each country did follow its own, it did have its production capacity, even if it were less efficient. And I think if we were to build a global international economy based on the principles of free trade and comparative advantage rather than absolute advantage, we would actually increase GDP. Right? The other way, increased profits for individual firms and multinational corporations, but not necessarily overall GDP. So that is something I think I think people are ready for radical ideas now, because what could be more radical than shutting down the world economy and telling everybody to stay at home and not go to work and not socialize and not, you know, not see off your dead relatives and all sorts of things. So, you know, nothing is too radical anymore, I think. And so hopefully new ideas would be able to come out to say, listen, how can we make this work better for all of us?
Okay, I mean, and again, that's a powerful point. That when I was growing up, I was in high school in the 80s, and the left versus right paradigm was about capitalism versus communism. Now the dialectical relationship, I guess, is between globalization and nationalism. And you're right that globalization has worked, but at the same time, it's had those that feel left behind and perhaps disaffected by it, not just in terms of certain countries feeling that they were perhaps exploited or whatever, they didn't get their fair share, however they define that, but even within countries, because when we look at the work of, as an economist, this guy, Thomas Piketty, this French genius, I think he is a genius, and he's really shown us how inequality has grown. And ever since the 80s coming forward, income inequalities within most of the Western countries that he has monitored has declined. That middle class is under pressure. And I guess as we have a worldwide economic contraction where basically trillions of dollars has disappeared from balance sheets, then you have that divide between and among countries would, you know, increase as well. So the question is, as you rightly put it, how do we create a system that is fit for purpose? You know, the other post-World War II institutions, be they the WTO, OPEC, the United Nations, NATO, or just anybody, they just seem to be in some sort of disarray, and we need to figure things out. So as we emerge from this, if we're emerging from this, what other points or trends do you think would guide us or give us a hint as to what's coming?
Yeah, actually, right now, I think everything is so open. Yeah, we could be moving more toward a dystopian future, or hopefully
Mhm.
hopefully something where we can construct a better future. One thing that I was actually very hopeful about and pushing very hard here was the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm.
Um, I I know, especially out here in the western part of the world, tremendous skepticism towards China, and during this coronavirus, it's gotten worse. Open hatred. This China is the enemy, and so in my, and this is going to have terrible consequences for the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think was the next step for the development of the global economy, because this was not just globalization through free trade and investment, which was more comparative advantage, which needed its
Mhm.
shift to, absolute advantage, which needed its shift to comparative advantage and proper principles of free trade. What this is even going more fundamental in terms of the productive infrastructure of the globe, and that it was creating productive infrastructure that would actually connect the entire world, just like the old Silk Road did in the pre-Columbian economies. And because we see this everywhere, wherever you build a road, you're going to get housing development, you're going to get economic development,
Mhm.
and it actually follows the infrastructure. Development follows the infrastructure. If you think of world history, that's how the Chinese civilization was built, along the canals and so forth. Or you think about ancient Egypt and the Nile River, everything was along the Nile. That's what, when you look at the development of European civilization, it's always along the Thames, along the Rhine, along the major river courses, because it's communication. Because if you can build something, you have to be able to sell it, right? And if you don't have the communications, the infrastructure to get it to a market or to customers that are outside of your little village or wherever, then you're not going to grow. So this was an amazing thing, and it was an investment into physical infrastructure, as opposed to the speculative bubbles and derivatives, which the cycles of inflation, bubbles, crashes, etc., and wiping off trillions of dollars in assets like in 2008 or whatever, and debt and more quantitative easing, etc. So I was very much trying to promote that. Trinidad and Tobago was a signatory to the Belt and Road Initiative, as were other countries, and I don't think we here understood really what its potential could have been, but at least we were officially on board, and I was really wanting to push that. This is going to be a tough sell now with all the propaganda. I have to call it that. This propaganda against China. I personally don't believe China wants to rule the world. Of course, they want to have a better place in the world.
Yeah.
Of course, they want their dignity and esteem to rise in the world. Of course, they want to do economically well. Of course, I mean, who doesn't, right? But that doesn't mean they have this malicious intent and want to bring down other countries. As someone who has followed, the country, its history, its progress, its thinking, they believe in win-win solutions. They're not a hostile force, and the 5,000 years of Chinese history demonstrates that even when they were, for thousands of years, the largest economy in the world, as alongside India as well, they never used it as a force of imperialism. Perhaps around, the kingdom, all right, Tibet and some of the border areas, okay, there's always border problems. But they never went and made a French Empire or a British Empire or whatnot, Yeah, I am very disappointed that next level, I think, is going to be much harder, and I'm not sure what is going to come up in its place. I'm not. People are talking about a second lockdown, and the second wave, and I think that's just going to hurt us more. And then and what's going to happen to the small and medium enterprises? Is this just going to be a world of big multinational corporations and big government and workers, and the working poor who own no assets and who have no independence? Is that the model of the world economy that's emerging? I think we're so much in the middle of things right now. It's hard to say. I guess I see it really as right now is a period of political and ideological battle. Right, things are still open. So let's argue for the type of world we want to create out of this. That's how I'd have to put it.
Absolutely. And like a couple of years ago, I mean, definitely in the early 2000s, the common narrative was that this is Asia-centric. And we had the explosion, not just of the Asian tigers, but the rise of China. Now, all of a sudden, well, again, I have a thesis that this pandemic has created nothing new. It has accelerated or exacerbated pre-existing trends. So that's, I mean, I could be wrong, still trying to figure it out, but that's my working hypothesis right now. Now, in terms of China, China's been a large extent the engine of Asia's growth, but China was slowing down even before the pandemic. It was still growing, mind you, but its rate of growth was slowing down noticeably. And you're right, they had this economic, export-driven economic growth model. And the next phase in its growth was, I guess, Belt and Road plus 5G. And Hugh controls, to me, 5G is kind of like what Britain did with its navy and its shipping. If you control the shipping lanes, especially the choke points, the Suez Canal, the Straits by Singapore, Hong Kong, you basically control the world.
That's right.
And then you fast forward the railroads, the Americans, then you fast forward, and then you think about the internet age.
I'll also add something there, which I've not seen a lot of people talk about, which I think is very important, which is the undersea cable, telegraph cables that were laid in the 19th century, which basically is still where our internet fiber is based on. We haven't, what those pioneers did in the 19th century and laid down those projects and in the process colonizing countries so they could get access to land and water and overthrowing governments. I mean, it was not a pretty business doing it, but they did it, and that infrastructure laid the basis for the second industrial revolution, and we are still just building on top of that. And as you said, the 5G network was something that was independent.
That was taking things up. I mean, that was leveling up to in a unprecedented way, in that it is like the undersea cables plus shipping. Basically you control the skies. And so that plus Belt and Road was really positioning China to be the next thing. It's not a multipolar world. It could potentially have been another unipolar world like the US was in the immediate post-World War II era. Now we have what we have, and that, seeing what's going on with Huawei and India and whatever, it seems unlikely that it would proceed without more hiccups. So I'm wondering whether we may see a pivot potentially in terms of away from Asia being the focal point of growth to, a retreat to Europe and North America as being that safe haven for not just for global capital, but for entrepreneurship, for private wealth, for high net worth families. Because basically you have a space that is continuing to grow, whereas Asia is voluntarily curtailing the economy. Sweden had positive economic growth in Q1 and Q2 this year. They didn't shut down. And now Norway and Germany are saying, maybe we shouldn't have shut down either. And when this next waves come, we're going to take a page out of Sweden's playbook. And well, the US is doing what it's doing. Russia. So, the West is approaching, I'm not judging it, the West is approaching it in a way that defends the economy, whereas Asia is prepared to put the economy as a sacrificial lamb. And so as a result, do you see that there will be a pivot back to the West and away from Asia?
I am not sure. That may be. I do think that the West has lost a lot of its dynamism, you know, and it's racked, you know. Let's say all the black power, Black Lives Matter movement is showing the serious cracks and dissension, and without that social without that social unity, it's going to be hard to build any prosperity on top of that. So there's a lot of these social problems that have to be addressed, and I'm not sure how close, because it's not only the racial issue, then it's the feminism, and it's the transgender, and it's, you know, and who knows what will come up next. There just seems to always be some something, some sort of injustice that keeps being pointed out, and that sort of social instability, I think, does you know, take away from economic dynamism, right? And I've not been observing as closely as perhaps I should the dynamic, or looking behind the downturn in the Asian market. I think I've since the 90s, when I read John Naisbitt's Megatrends Asia. I don't know if you ever read that. That is so brilliant.
Yeah.
And it's like everything he said there has come true. And all the basis of in analysis. I still kind of have this thing that everything he says is correct, and that this may be a little blip down, but the secular trend is still Asia centric, right? So there may be a little downward part, but it's going to get back up, because all the fundamental dynamics, I think, are in Asia's favor. I think what might happen is almost like a 1984 scenario, like George Orwell, where you have Oceania. What were the three? You had Oceania, which is kind of the West led by Britain, and then you had, I can't remember what he called Asia, and then there was another. But the world is divided into three huge blocks, and they would sometimes be at war, sometimes be at peace, and you know, and it'd be this totalitarian system inside. It seems like we're kind of moving towards something like that. The West may shut itself off. No Huawei, no Chinese components here. We're going to do everything on our own, and then, you know, Asia might have its own thing, so its own technology, its own connectivity. You know, so just like we still, when we go from one continent to another, we need to change our plugs. You have to see if it's 110 or 240. You know, it might be worse than that. Might not just be plugs. It might not just be voltage. It might be a whole series of things that are going to be incompatible and two separate worlds, which I don't think is the best way forward, especially, you know, people like us whose ancestry crosses East and West, and whose family and personal history, you know, has been across these divides. We personally are not insular and only belong to one sphere or another. So definitely from our personal perspectives, we might not see that as a good thing. Perhaps there are other people who do see it as a good thing. I don't know. But in terms of global development, from a global perspective, I think it will be slower. You know, I don't think it can be argued any other way. I think that if the world is going to be locked up into these industrial, technological, social blocks that have little interaction with each other, you know, if you think about when the Spanish Empire existed, and the French Empire existed, and the British Empire existed, and, you know, there were all these maritime laws where you could only trade among the British. If you're a British Empire, in the French, you could only trade among the French, and and Trinidad and Tobago, where we are, was always between the Spanish, so between the Catholic bloc and the Protestant bloc, because then the Spanish and French would sometimes ally. So Trinidad on the border became a place of smuggling, right, between the Spanish Empire and the British Empire, right? So you might find, so you will always find, whenever there's these great blocks that are not supposed to trade, you'll find the border areas of people smuggling things underneath the law, and that's a kind of global economy that may also come. I think we would be robbing humanity of the synergy that would come from the interaction of East and West. But perhaps this is the way history moves. It's not a straight line. It's up and down, back and forth. But hopefully, secular trend is positive and not self-destruction.
That's a fair point. That's worthy for the reflection. I think it's Mark Twain that said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme." And as I look at what's happening now, you're right. So there's a part of the world where we communicate. We're on Facebook, we WhatsApp each other, Instagram or whatever. And then there's a part that's blocked off into the super apps, where there's Weibo and WeChat and the whole Tencent empire. And instead of Amazon, they're on Alibaba. So, that divide will probably increase. I mean, we're now on Zoom. I know that because Zoom has this connection to China, certain governments in Australia and the US, they forbid employees from using Zoom. And maybe we would create these silos. And then that's in terms of information or the virtual world. In terms of the physical world, we're seeing an evolution in how we travel. So before it was a passport plus maybe a visa, but now it's a health certificate, and now there are travel bubbles. So if you're part of a travel bubble, I mean, this obviously supersedes all the visa rules. Now, we'll find out in a couple of days, but I was looking online because I'm planning to travel to Europe. And from the US, it's likely that travel from the US into Europe is going to be banned, and it's, you have to be part of a travel bubble like Australia, New Zealand, or within the EU, or so on and so forth. So you're right. So both in terms of physical and in terms of virtual, we may see a pushback against globalization and the creation of these political and economic bubbles. And that's where you'll be more or less restricted, which of course, as you said, it creates arbitrage opportunities for those who can transit between one bubble and another. So that's a great point.
Yeah. So these are the possible futures, and we all have to do our part from where we are. If we are in any positions of influence, to try to influence it to the way we think best, hopefully for humanity rather than just our own pockets. But but hopefully both can coincide.
Absolutely. Dr. Kirk, Megu, thank you very much for sharing your time, your insights, and your perspectives. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and I wish you and your listeners a great day.